Namaste students, welcome back to Web Technology video learning series. We have been going through various aspects of JavaScript. In last two lessons, we have covered the conditional statement executions and looping constructs that we have in JavaScript. With that, we have covered most of the basics that we find common across all the programming languages. But one thing that is definitely required for every programming language is an ability to create modular and reusable code. Such a modular and reusable code in most programming languages is called function. So in today's lesson, we'll go through what is a function and we'll take a look at some of the examples functions that we have in JavaScript. Let's look at an example on the right hand side and some explanation. Try to make sense out of whatever code is there on the right hand side. Some part of this code is you should be already familiar because I just reused the code from our looping construct example but made it into a function. In JavaScript, functions are reusable blocks of code defined with the function keyword. You will find the function keyword in line number 2. Then these functions are executed when invoked. What is invoking? Invoking essentially is calling that function. Sometimes it is also called invoking. Invoking and calling that function are more or less synonyms in terms of programming terminology. So we can say either of them. So we say when a function is invoked, then it is executed. Functions have parameters, and if the function has any parameters, they are listed in the parenthesis in the definition of the function. Look at the example, line number 2. It has one parameter, needed book. If you compare with C, you'll immediately say, oh, there is no data type for here. There is no int I or string or char star or whatever. It is just giving the variable name. True. But if you also remember in JavaScript, there are no explicit data type assignments. The type assignment happens at runtime, which is why it is called weakly typed language. So we just use the variable name. In line number 3, the needed book is the parameter. If there can be more than one parameter, they can just be listed with a comma separated list. And when a JavaScript reaches a return keyword, the function will stop executing and then execution goes back to the caller. You should already be now familiar with the for off statement. But notice the use of return in line number 8 and also in line number 11. We are invoking this function from line number 15 and line number 18. When we invoke this function from line number 15, the parameter needed book will be initialized to the string Ramayana and will be searched inside the array. Because we have that book in the array, line number 8 will be hit and it returns true. The returned value will be assigned to the variable x. This is much like any other programming language. There is no difference here, except that there are no data types. The return happens almost very similarly. The execution stops in our case in line number 8 and comes back to line number 15 where x will have the value true. Now after this, the execution continues and goes to line number 18. The same function is called again, but here we are trying to find the book Gita and it is not there in our array. Therefore, the for loop does not hit line number 8 because the condition 7 is never evaluated to false. It hits line number 11 and it returns false. So y will become false. So the coming back to the caller is called returning, and it is caused by the return keyword, is what I'm trying to say. Now, we have not talked about the name find book in line number 2. This is the name of the function, and it should immediately be there after the function keyword. The name of the function is also an identifier, and therefore it should follow all the rules that we have discussed in one of the earlier classes about how to name the function, how to name the identifiers. The same rules are applicable for naming the functions also. The functions are special in the sense that they can also be considered as objects, they can also be part of the objects, but they are somewhat different way of doing things. So for our discussion, we will limit ourselves to using the functions by their names. I hope you understood the notion of a function. The notion of a function is very similar to the other programming languages, and the only difference here is that there is a function keyword. There is no return type declaration, or there is no parameter type declaration, because there is no such thing in JavaScript. Okay, otherwise they are similar. In general, the functions that we encounter in JavaScript are divided into 3 categories. User defined functions, like the function we saw in the previous slide, a function defined by us and used by us. Library functions, there are different kinds of library functions that we have in JavaScript. String manipulation function, math function, window function. There are different predefined functions that are available for us as part of a specific library. We can use that library, and then we get all those functions for us. And then there are some built-in functions. These built-in functions are useful for us. You can say whether they are part of the library or not, but they are pretty much useful for us, so we call them as built-in functions that we can use right away. We'll look at some of the popular built-in functions that we will use as part of our programming. These built-in functions, 3 of them we'll go through in today's lesson, are essentially meant to aid interactivity to the JavaScript, to the HTML, to the user. If ever we want to communicate a message to the user, we need a mechanism to be able to tell the user, saying that okay, I want to do this, or there is a message issue, or all those kind of things, right? So there are 3 functions that are built in, that are useful for us in that category. We'll cover them now. The first of them is an alert function. Look at the syntax on the left hand side. Alert, and then it takes a function it takes a parameter which is essentially a message, which is a string. What this alert function does is it pops up a dialog box to the user on the browser and gives out the message with a OK or a close button. The exact button and exact appearance of the dialog box is both browser and operating system specific, but it is a prompt to the user, and user is required to dismiss the dialog by clicking on the only button available in the dialog box. This is really called a notification dialog. When this function is called, the execution is suspended and the alert is shown to the user, and the execution remains suspended until user dismisses or disposes of that dialog box by clicking on the button. Once that happens, execution returns back to the JavaScript code. As I said, the look and feel of the alert dialog are browser dependent. Take a look at 2 examples that are there. One is a Safari browser, the other, the top one, and the bottom one is a dialog box as shown by a Firefox browser. The code is very simple. Look at the example on the top right. It's a simple function. If the age is greater than 45, then we'll give an alert to saying that eligible for COVID vaccine. We are again going back to our if conditions, but instead of writing something onto the HTML, we are giving a more appropriate notification, eligibility. So alert function just displays a notification dialog box, and it shows in the dialog box, it shows the message that is passed out to it as a parameter. But not all the sometimes we also want to ask user, do you want to continue or not? So sometimes the user interactivity is not just dismissing the dialog, is also saying whether user wants to continue or not. So it is more called yes no kind of a dialog, or okay cancel kind of a dialog. JavaScript also has such a provision. Such a dialog box is called confirmation dialog box. The confirmation dialog box syntax is very similar to the alert function. The name of the function is confirm, and whatever message is supplied as part of as a parameter is shown in the dialog box. But instead of showing just one button, here we show two buttons. The buttons can be yes no or okay cancel, and the ordering of okay and cancel could be different based on the operating system and the browser that is being used. Again, once this function is called, the execution remains suspended in JavaScript until user dismisses the dialog by clicking at least one of the buttons. Once user clicks on either of the buttons, the execution comes back to the JavaScript, but more importantly, there is a variable that is filled that indicates whether user clicked OK button or the cancel button. Let's look at the example. Line number 5 is where we are showing the confirmation dialog box. So let's say user is trying to book vaccination for multiple people, and one of them has an age less than 18. So we are checking if user should continue with the booking for the other people, or all booking should be stopped, right? So we use a dialog box, confirmation dialog box, in line number 5 to ask that question. And once user clicks OK, the return value is captured in the variable R. Once user clicks OK, R will become true, and if user clicks cancel, R will become false. So then we use a simple if else statement to capture whether the user clicked OK or user clicked cancel. Accordingly, we continue booking with the rest of the people. I hope this is clear. But again, sometimes we need even more interactivity. We saw an interactivity where user is given a message. We saw more interactivity with the confirmation by asking user to choose one of the two available options. But sometimes we want more than just the two options. We want user to give some input as by typing something. Let's look at an example and how that can be done in JavaScript. Such a thing is called a prompting dialog box. The syntax is similar to the alert and confirm, except that here we have an additional parameter. The function name is called prompt. It takes two strings as input. One is a message that is to be used, and second is a default text. Okay. Prompt will show the dialog box with an input field, a text box, and whatever is supplied as a second parameter to the prompt function will appear as the predefined text in the text box. Okay. So the prompt function displayed the supplies message as a question in the prompt dialog, and it pre-fills the text box with whatever is supplied as a second parameter. Now again, execution gets suspended once the prompt function is called until user disposes of the dialog by either pressing OK or cancel. Now the returned value will be the user text, entered text if user says okay. Otherwise, it will be a null or an empty string. So we have to check for them and accordingly do the processing further. Let's look at the example in line number 5. Here the context is we are trying to book the vaccination, but now we are trying to ask user what is the preferred vaccination center. So we are suggesting they could choose Delhi, but user is more than welcome to change this and then do something else, right? So line number 5 is asking the preferred vaccination center, and the text box is pre-filled with Delhi, but user can change it. Once user changes this and or not change it and clicks OK, the returned value is captured in the variable R. If R is either null or an empty string, it means that user cancelled it. User clicked on cancel. Otherwise, the user entered string is captured as part of R. So, we will basically say in line number 11 that we are trying to book in the desired vaccination center. That is a prompting dialog box. These three dialog boxes are primary means of adding little bit of interactivity to the user by asking questions, by asking user to make a choice, or by asking user to give some input. There are some mathematical functions. I know we have talked about string functions, but we'll cover string functions in a separate lesson. There are mathematical functions. Math, I'm sure when we discussed about the built-in objects, we said math is one of the built-in objects, and there are many functions that can be invoked on that object. Here is that list. You can go through them at leisure, but generally speaking, math object has a lot of functions that are meant to do a lot of computation, and so instead of us having to do all the calculations within our code, there are existing library functions which can do the calculation and then return the value. So we just have to reuse. For example, there is an exponential, there is a floor function that can round a value and then give us the value. Then there is a log function that can calculate the natural logarithm of a given value, and so on and so forth. I recommend you get familiar with these functions. If ever we need to do mathematical calculations, we will be relying on the math object member functions. So that's all we have in this lesson. We went through the fundamentals of functions, how to define one, and then what are the parameters, what are the return parameters, and how to invoke the function, and so on and so forth. We went through different types of functions and tried to take a look at the three primary alerting functions or interactivity functions that are most used in JavaScript: alert, confirm, and prompt functions. Then we just had a skim at some of the math object functions which are meant to provide us ready-made implementations of some of the calculations. I hope you enjoyed the lesson so far. I am sure you are trying to think that the JavaScript is an interesting programming language. It is indeed interesting, and it is very powerful as well. We'll see each other in our next class. Until then, thank you.